What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Saturday. We're switching things up a bit. As you may have noticed, we've added quarterbacks into the tight ends video, and we've also shifted it over to Saturday. This is going to be a completely different video. The format switched a bit. We can improve upon it in the coming weeks, but for now, the way that it's going to operate, we're going to be going over each position, that being quarterbacks and tight ends, in batches of 5. So we'll start with the tight end 1 through 5, move over to the TE 6 through 10, then round it out with the QB 11 through 15. While doing that, in each range or tier you could consider it, we will highlight 1 to 2 players with matchups we either think are being underrated, we think there is more upside than meets the eye, or if we believe the matchup comes with a bit more risk than expected, we'll let you know of that as well. By the end of this video, we should have touched upon about 10 to 15 players, while also letting you know about how we feel about the players in that overall tier. Before we do get into the video though, let's talk about the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which quarterback currently leads the league in dropped passes. At the time of recording, unfortunately, nobody had gotten that question right yet. The correct answer was actually Ben Roethlisberger, but there will not be a Sunday video, so you have 2 days to answer this one. Which quarterback currently leads the league in red zone pass attempts? Once again, that's which quarterback currently leads the league in red zone pass attempts. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With that being said, let's hop right into the top 5 tight ends. In this range, we of course have Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, Hunter Henry, as well as Dallas Goedert. Pretty familiar territory for most names here. As you may have noticed, we have Mark Andrews listed as red. And no, that's not because I'm saying that you should be sitting Mark Andrews. We have him ranked inside the top 5, of course, but just know there is going to be additional risk when starting Mark Andrews than you typically would have. Of course, the big news here is that Lamar Jackson is not going to be starting. He is on the COVID reserve list, leaving RG3 to lead this team from the quarterback position. 2 players, Lamar Jackson and RG3, they have a very similar skill set, but whenever we're switching from one quarterback to another, there is going to be some overall risk we're going to assume when starting the pieces around him. Now, when it comes to the safety and security of those pieces, Mark Andrews is much more safe and secure than a player like Marquise Brown. Not as much precision needed to get Mark Andrews the ball as opposed to a player like Brown, but still, the matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, it's already a super difficult matchup for tight ends to begin with. Currently, the Pittsburgh Steelers allow the second fewest fantasy points to the position. Believe it or not, they've only allowed 1 receiving touchdown all season long to a tight end. So when it comes to Mark Andrews this week, it seems like there are a lot of factors stacked against him. The next tight end I'm going to highlight in this range is going to be Hunter Henry. He's highlighted in green because I do think he makes a pretty solid start this week. From a floor perspective, we always know what we can expect from Hunter Henry, that being consistent volume. Hunter Henry has actually averaged 6.5 targets per game since week 5. 6.5 targets is more than enough to get it done, especially from the tight end position, a position that's typically touchdown or bust for the most part. And on an offense led by a quarterback like Justin Herbert, who puts you into scoring range quite frequently, Hunter Henry is always in a prime position to reach his ceiling. Unfortunately, we saw a long stretch in which he didn't, but over the past 2 matchups, he's actually reached pay dirt on both occasions. His receiving floor is virtually 4 receptions, which he's had in each of the past 4 weeks. And this week, he's in a matchup against Buffalo, and surprisingly, or possibly unsurprisingly, the Buffalo Bills allow the 3rd most fantasy points to the tight end position. When looking back at their past 4 matchups, you will notice that they haven't allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end through that span, but if you look just a little bit deeper at the actual teams that they faced, there really wasn't a high amount of talent at the tight end position. We have teams like Arizona, Seattle, New England, and the New York Jets, neither of which have a consistent top 15 tight end. So when looking back further than that, where they had matchups against tight ends like Darren Waller, Jonnu Smith, Travis Kelce, and Mike Gesicki, each of those tight ends scored against them. So when looking back just a little bit further, we see that the Buffalo Bills allowed 6 receiving touchdowns to tight ends in a 5-game span. With that being said, we're going to hop into the next 5 tight ends. This is going to be TE 6 through 10. It's safe to assume overall that the expectations for the tight ends ranked in this range should be pretty similar. Their floors and their ceilings may vary a bit due to the matchup or the situation surrounding them, but the overall production and our expectations, they shouldn't veer out too much, even from the tight end 6 to the tight end 10. We're going to start with with a player like Evan Engram. As you'll notice, we have Evan Engram up on the board. He is highlighted in green, meaning we think he makes a safe and secure start that many people may be sleeping on. Most of it does come down to the actual matchup. He faces Cincinnati, who has been, across the season, one of the worst teams at defending opposing fantasy tight ends. Over the past 3 weeks, they've tightened it up a bit, but still rank in the bottom 5 at defending that position. I will say that they have only had 3 games throughout this entire season in which they've allowed a touchdown to a tight end, but the name of the game for Evan Engram is not in the area of touchdowns, it's of course through volume. Evan Engram has actually scored only 1 receiving touchdown on the season. He's had a rushing touchdown, but 3 games so far this year, he has had double-digit targets. He has had 5+ receptions in 3 of his past 4 contests. So in this matchup against Cincinnati, he should have a very safe floor with some upside to match along with it. A player that I'm a bit more weary about is going to be Noah Fant of the Denver Broncos. Now, there's always a wild card thrown in when you have a polarizing player like Taysom Hill who steps in and produces in his first start. Of course, there's always going to be some questions whether Taysom Hill, he either overexceeded. His last matchup was, of course, against the Atlanta Falcons, one of the weaker defenses in the league. Playing against the Denver Broncos would be a completely different type of situation. The reason I bring that up and why that's so important is because if Taysom Hill does pop off or look anything like he did against Atlanta, the overall opportunities for this Denver Broncos offense may be a bit fewer and further between than we typically would see in other matchups. Taysom Hill, being a mobile quarterback, keeps the clock alive. We saw him put together sustained drives. So if the Denver Broncos have fewer offensive opportunities, and that does hold true once again with Taysom Hill performing like he did against Atlanta, Noah Fant's floor could be lower than meets the eye. One thing we must also keep in mind is that Noah Fant is a prime contender to be an example of a tale of 2 seasons, meaning the production we saw in the first half of the year prior to his first injuries, it looks night and day different than what we're seeing as of late. Since returning from injury, he's had 4 or fewer receptions in 4 or 5 games. He has not caught a receiving touchdown since week 2 and has not had a game in which he's had double-digit targets since week 3. That is going to combine with the New Orleans Saints, who are actually trending in the other direction at defending tight ends. To start the season and in the first 4 weeks, they were the worst defense against defending that position, but since then, they've been climbing their way back up. Through the first 5 weeks, they allowed a touchdown to a tight end in each contest, but over the last 5 weeks, they have not allowed a single receiving touchdown to that position. Only 1 game through that span has a tight end been able to eclipse 15 receiving yards, so when it comes to Noah Fant this week, the risk in his start, it's going to be higher than meets the eye. We're going to move over to the tight ends 11 through 15. In this range, we have the back end tight end 1s. We also have a few of the premier streaming options, but the floor and the ceiling for each of the tight ends in this range can seriously be called into question. The first player I have highlighted, you'll notice, is of course Jonnu Smith. This is a player whose fantasy value is really hanging on by a thread at this point. He has in fact caught 2 receiving touchdowns in 2 of his past 3 games, and in the 1 game that he didn't catch a receiving touchdown, he ran one in against Indianapolis. Indianapolis is going to be the defense that he faces once again in this week's matchup. As we know, the Indianapolis Colts are one of the best defenses at defending opposing tight ends, and what I'll also say about his recent production over the past 3 weeks is that while he has been able to reach pay dirt through those 3 games in PPR leagues, he has still only produced a high of 12 fantasy points. If you're telling me a player has scored in each of the past 3 games and only has a high of 12 fantasy points, it just goes to show you exactly how low their floor is. And when playing against a top 3 defense at mitigating fantasy points to tight ends, the odds of him reaching his floor versus his ceiling is much higher than it would be in other contests. The Indianapolis Colts, they did allow a receiving touchdown to Robert Tonyan last week. Before that, they had not allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end all season long. So Jonnu Smith, he definitely has an uphill battle and has only eclipsed 2 receptions in a single game since week 5. The final tight end I'm going to bring up before we move over to quarterbacks is going to be Jordan Reed of the San Francisco 49ers. Reed is definitely a player, if you don't have any positive options, if they're not listed in our top 15 right now and haven't played yet, maybe you should consider grabbing grabbing Reed off of your waiver wire. He's only owned in about 15% of leagues, so he's definitely available out there, and the San Francisco 49ers are really hurting for receivers. Brandon Ayuk has been ruled out. Deebo Samuel, this will be his first game back, so we're not sure exactly how many snaps he's going to play. And Richie James, the offensive hero against Green Bay a few weeks ago, he really followed that up by posting a dud, so it's really difficult to trust his involvement as well. Jordan Reed could possibly be the top pass catching option for Nick Mullins in this contest. And while this matchup against the Rams does seem very difficult on paper, the LA Rams are much stronger at defending opposing fantasy receivers than the tight end position. The tight end position may be an area where the 49ers are able to find success offensively, and if that is the case, then Jordan Reed has the potential to produce a really good outcome. Alright guys, we're going to move over to the quarterback position, and we'll start with the top 5 quarterbacks. We have the usual suspects here: Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Russell Wilson, and you will notice a green highlighted Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert has an immense amount of upside in this matchup against Buffalo. Yes, it will be on the road. Buffalo will be a bit colder than what he's used to over in LA, but this game has shootout potential written all over it. The LA Chargers are heading into this matchup as 4.5 point underdogs. The Buffalo Bills, especially as of late defensively, have not been able to stop any position, so the potential of Justin Herbert playing from behind for much of this contest, but finding success whenever he's targeting his wide receivers, his tight ends, even the running backs can help and sustain these drives. The potential for that to happen is very, very high in this contest. As for Justin Herbert himself, only in his first 2 contests did he not have a multi-TD passing performance. He has had a rushing touchdown in 3 of his 9 games, so a ratio of 1-3, and believe it or not, has had 3+ passing touchdowns in 5 of his past 7 games. The floor for Justin Herbert is extremely high. The projected total in this game is 53 points, so the safety and the upside of Justin Herbert in this contest is something we should all be getting excited for. I don't have any major concerns with any of the other quarterbacks listed in the top 5 here, so we'll move over to the quarterbacks 6 through 10, in which there is a quarterback that I think has a bit more risk than meets the eye. That, of course, being Taysom Hill. You'll see him highlighted in red here, and while yes, he's coming off of a very phenomenal performance, this was his first start. It was against a poor Atlanta Falcons defense, and for those of you starting him in the tight end position in ESPN leagues, no, I'm not concerned about that. Any tight end playing the quarterback position, the position that scores the most fantasy points, it's going to be a net positive regardless of the result. But let's say you were streaming quarterbacks and now you have Taysom Hill in your starting lineup and you're trusting him to produce like he did against Atlanta a week ago. There are just a few concerns that I would have. First of all, the Atlanta Falcons allowed the most fantasy points to the quarterback position as a whole. Only 2 times on the entire season has a quarterback facing Atlanta not been able to eclipse 20 fantasy points, and in one of those games, the result was 18.4 points. On the flip side, they have allowed a really high end of fantasy production to quarterbacks. Taysom Hill's 24 points, while very respectable, only ranks 5th when comparing the 10 quarterbacks that have faced Atlanta so far this season. Don't get me wrong though, I still believe Taysom Hill will have a strong floor due to his rushing ability. Just keep in mind though that the upside may be called into question. The Denver Broncos over the past 2 weeks have allowed a combined 17.26 fantasy points to the quarterback position. No, that's not an average, that's a total. So the average is going to be under 9 fantasy points per game over the last 2 contests. So they are tightening things up, but in those 2 contests, they did play Tua as well as Derek Carr. This does make a perfect segue into our next player, which is of course Derek Carr, who you'll notice did crack the top 10 this week. A lot of the factors that I had mentioned in Taysom Hill for how he could have had a successful game against Atlanta, one that may inflate his value over what we truly should expect. Well, Derek Carr, he's going to be able to reap the benefits of that because he plays Atlanta this week. No need to go super in depth as to why, of course, because we had just mentioned that 9 of 10 games so far this season, the floor of fantasy points has been 18.4 at the quarterback position. 18.4 points, definitely good enough for a top 10 finish. And Derek Carr has already shown us a bit of his ceiling with 5 games so far this season, eclipsing 20 fantasy points, including one just last week, so he's coming off of a hot game. While Derek Carr usually isn't ranked in this range, we definitely think that's the type of upside he brings to the table this week. So if you're in a pinch, need a player to start who might be available on the waiver wire, look for Derek Carr this week. We're moving into quarterbacks 11 through 15. Keep in mind though that there were already 4 teams that have already played, so the player pool for the quarterbacks is a bit more shrunk than it typically would be. The first quarterback you will see highlighted here is Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins, as of late, especially the past 3 games, has played his most consistent and best football we've seen for the entire season. 2 of the past 3 games he's thrown 3 touchdowns. The game in between that he threw 2 touchdowns, and it's almost surprising to see him post 66 pass attempts over the past 2 games, knowing exactly how low the volume for the passing game in Minnesota can truly be. The reason I do think the risk in Kirk Cousins could be a bit higher this week than what it has been the past few weeks is because whenever a quarterback relies only on his passing ability, the floor for him is always going to be low. If we had the choice, we would always like to get those rushing quarterbacks to increase the floor, making the passing volume bring us the upside. Kirk Cousins, he doesn't have that luxury. Also, Adam Thielen, his primary target in the red zone, he's not expected to play this week, and while Justin Jefferson is extremely talented, it's really difficult to trust him against a strong Carolina Panthers pass defense. With defenses able to more focus on Jefferson, that means the pieces around him have to get more involved in the passing game. Is that possible? Yes. Should that be our expectation? No. So the risk when it comes to starting Kirk Cousins, while he is trending upward and he does have somewhat of a ceiling, his floor in this matchup is going to be in fact lower. The final quarterback I'm going to bring up in this video is going to be Carson Wentz of the Philadelphia Eagles. This week they have the Monday night matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, who allow the second most fantasy points to the position. The formula for this one, guys, is very simple. Carson Wentz has been very feast or famine. If you're a person who really needs to take a shot, you know your opponent this week has the potential to completely pop off, maybe you want to look for Carson Wentz, who can be found on your waiver wire because he's only owned in about 60% of ESPN leagues. There is no way I can sit here and promote Carson Wentz as a safe option. He's been the poster boy for feast or famine, and lately it's been a famine to say the least. His high in fantasy points over the last 3 contests has been just over 14, but we do have to take into consideration that in the 4 games before that, 3 of those 4 games he was able to eclipse 20 fantasy points, and 2 of those 4 games he went over 27. If there was a game for him to get it back together with all of the pieces around him, it would definitely be this one against Seattle, a defense as well, who has been playing feast or famine against quarterbacks. Considering the fact that the Seattle Seahawks allow the second most fantasy points to the quarterback position, it's safe to say that most quarterbacks do feast against them, but we also can't be surprised if Carson Wentz continues his trend of putting up duds. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.